They say if you stand alone in the ruins of Chakteach Castle on a winter night, you can still hear the screams faint broken carried on the wind, like the last breath of a dying soul. Not echoes of ghosts, but of girls, hundreds of them, girls who came to serve a noblewoman and left as nothing more than bloodstains on cold stone. Some say the walls drank their suffering. Others say the ground itself remembers their names. The castle has been abandoned for over 400 years, but the air still carries a metallic tang iron decay and something far worse, the memory of cruelty so deep it became ritual. This is not a ghost story. This is history. In the year 1610, deep inside this fortress, a woman of noble blood sat in a bathtub not filled with water but with blood, thick, steaming, fresh. She believed it could make her young again. She believed it made her beautiful. The girl who had just died to fill that tub was 16. Her crime, pulling her mistress's hair while brushing it. Her punishment. Death slow, deliberate, and drenched in terror. The woman who ordered it all didn't blink. She never did. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and she would go on to kill more girls than any female murderer in recorded history. But to understand how a woman could bathe in blood and sleep soundly at night, we have to go back to a time when power was unchecked, superstition was law, and the lives of the poor meant nothing. Because Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just a killer. She was the product of a system that allowed monsters to thrive as long as they were rich, beautiful, and born in a castle. And what you're about to hear is her true story. It began with a slap, just a moment of anger, a twitch of aristocratic irritation at the hands of a servant girl who had the misfortune of tugging too hard on a strand of hair. But the slap didn't just bruise, it cut. And as the girl stumbled back bleeding, the Countess noticed something odd. Her own skin, where the girl's blood had splattered, looked different, smoother, younger, brighter. Whether it was illusion, madness, or a trick of the candlelight hardly mattered. In that instant, Elizabeth Bathory became convinced she had found the secret to eternal youth, and from that belief, hundreds of innocent lives would be drained literally. The infamous bloodbath wasn't a myth born of exaggeration. It was a ritual, real, repeated, and deeply horrifyingly deliberate. Inside the stone belly of Chakteach Castle, in a hidden chamber, shielded by thick walls and heavy curtains, Elizabeth orchestrated her rejuvenation. There she sat naked in a silver tub, not filled with perfumed water like a queen, but with blood. Fresh blood. Blood still steaming from the bodies of teenage girls. And it wasn't enough to simply kill them. No, Elizabeth believed that pain made the blood more potent, that terror refined its power. So she didn't just bathe in blood, she marinated in suffering. Her victims were chosen for their beauty, youth, and purity. Servant girls barely 15, peasant daughters desperate for work. They were stripped, hung upside down, and sliced open with surgical precision. Their blood would cascade into the basin below, drop by agonizing drop. Elizabeth would then step in slowly, her pale, aging flesh disappearing beneath the crimson surface as she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, believing she was reversing time. That death could buy her youth. But it didn't stop at bathing. She began collecting blood in silver bowls and dabbing it on her face like a cosmetic. She stored vials of it, smeared it on her chest, rubbed it into her thighs. What began as obsession turned to ritual, and what began as ritual turned into addiction. The Countess had tasted something stronger than power, stronger than beauty. She had tasted godhood, or so she believed. In her warped mind, she wasn't a killer. She was an alchemist of the flesh, a high priestess of blood. But outside her chambers, the land whispered. Servants vanished, families grieved, and villagers began to fear the shadow of the castle on the hill. What's truly horrifying is not just what she did, but how long she got away with it. For 6 years, these murders continued, hidden in plain sight. And society let it happen, because the girls were poor, because Elizabeth was noble, because no one wanted to believe that a woman so graceful, so educated, so untouchable could be a monster. But behind the lace gloves and jeweled rings, her hands were soaked in the blood of the innocent. And the bath, it became more than a symbol of vanity. It became her throne, her church, her drug. She bathed while others wept. She soaked while others died. And still she looked into the mirror and saw nothing wrong. This is what unchecked power looks like when it festers. This is what evil becomes when it's protected by status, sealed inside castle walls and fed with silence. Elizabeth Bathory didn't just murder girls. She butchered hope, sacrificed innocence, and turned beauty into something grotesque. And yet, this was only the beginning, because the blood wasn't enough, not forever. And soon Elizabeth would hunt not just servants, but noble daughters, and that finally would seal her fate. But before the fall came the frenzy, and in the dim light of those flickering torches as blood ran thicker than wine, Elizabeth truly believed, that death had become her fountain of youth, and no one dared stop her. Before she ever spilled a drop of blood, Elizabeth Bathory was born into it. Her cradle was not woven with silk alone, but with centuries of war power and cruelty. The Bathory name was legend, etched into the very fabric of Eastern European nobility. Her family crest bore dragons and wolves, symbols of conquest and fear. And from the moment she took her first breath in 1560, Elizabeth was never just a girl. She was a legacy, an heir to something ancient, violent, and deeply revered. Her father was Baron George VI, Bathory, a warlord with a brutal sense of justice. Her mother, Anna Bathory, came from a line that included kings of Poland and princes of Transylvania. Elizabeth's uncle was Stephen Bathory, Prince of Transylvania, and eventually King of Poland. Royalty was not a dream in her household, it was the wallpaper, the furniture, the air. It surrounded her, and with it came entitlement, but also exposure to a darker truth. Nobility was power built on blood. From a young age, Elizabeth witnessed executions. Torture was not an aberration, it was a tool. Whispers of family members dabbling in occult rituals. Satanic rites and sadistic punishments were common. Her cousin was rumored to sew a servant girl's mouth shut for speaking out of turn. Her aunt practiced healing through bloodletting and astrology. And Elizabeth watched, listened, absorbed. This was not horror to her. This was heritage. She was given a sharp education rare for women of her time. She learned Latin, German, Greek, and Hungarian. She read history, philosophy, and even texts on anatomy and herbalism. To outsiders, this made her a Renaissance woman. But inside Choctaw Castle, her knowledge wasn't used for enlightenment, it was used for precision. The same girl who could quote Cicero would one day instruct how to puncture a vein to ensure the blood didn't clot too quickly in her chalice. Perhaps the most haunting influence came not from her books, but from her family's obsession with dominance and fear. The Bathorys ruled their lands with iron fists. Rebellion was crushed. Disobedience was met with cruelty. And Elizabeth learned the lesson early: to rule is to control, and to control is to punish. Love was not the language of power, fear was. She was also plagued by something else: illness. Rumors swirled of epilepsy, fits of rage, even visions. At the time, noble families often turned to blood rituals, superstitions, and folk remedies to cleanse or cure such afflictions. It's entirely possible that Elizabeth's obsession with blood as a restorative source began here, not from vanity, but from desperation. From a belief perhaps instilled by her family that blood had divine or magical properties. But whatever flicker of innocence she had didn't survive the environment she was born into. The Bathory legacy didn't raise daughters. It forged predators. By the time she was engaged at just 10 years old to Ferenc Nádasdy, a nobleman known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his savagery and war, Elizabeth was already being shaped into something cold, calculating, and dangerously intelligent. When they finally wed, she was only 15. He gifted her not jewelry, but a castle and a dungeon, a place to rule and to experiment, and to... Some stories say that Ferenc taught her torture techniques as a form of bonding, that he sent her letters describing battlefield executions with a kind of pride. Whether out of love or pathology, Elizabeth didn't recoil, she took notes. And so before a single girl ever screamed behind the castle walls, a monster was quietly being raised behind velvet curtains. Not created overnight, but bred by blood, by birthright, by a name that carried more weight than morality, and by a family who taught her from the cradle that you don't rule by kindness, you rule by fear. She didn't just witness violence, she drank it in like wine. Before Elizabeth Bathory ever laid hands on her victims, she was a child surrounded by cruelty masquerading as order. In the feudal aristocracy of 16th century Hungary, brutality wasn't hidden. It was law. It was justice. It was entertainment. And for a young noblewoman born into one of the most powerful dynasties in Eastern Europe, that violence wasn't only visible, it was instructive. From the high balconies of her family's castle, Elizabeth likely watched servants whipped until their backs split open for minor infractions. She saw thieves, mutilated rebels, executed women burned for witchcraft, their screams rising with the smoke fading into the cold Carpathian sky. These weren't isolated incidents. This was daily life. Punishment was spectacle, and power was defined by the ability to inflict it. Her household staff were not caretakers. They were tools of control. Every mistake a servant made became a lesson in authority. A spilled drink could mean a slap, a missing needle, a beating. If a stable boy so much as looked the wrong way at a noble child, he might be gone by morning. And Elizabeth, still in ribbons and lace, watched how fear kept people quiet, obedient, and small. She was taught early that blood silences rebellion faster than words ever could. Historians speculate that her first acts of cruelty began not in adulthood, but in adolescence. That she would test her status by striking maids or ordering servants to kneel for hours in the cold. Some claim she enjoyed watching others suffer, not out of sadism at first, but out of curiosity, like a child pulling the wings off a fly just to see what happens. But curiosity has a way of growing teeth, and her family didn't stop her. If anything, they encouraged it. Her husband, Ferenc Nádasdy, known as the Black Knight, was a seasoned warrior who had impaled enemies on stakes and burned entire villages. He reportedly taught Elizabeth how to punish disobedient servants using tools like needles, pincers, and burning coals. One infamous tale claims he gifted her a spiked glove as a wedding present. Not jewelry, not perfume, a weapon. It was a courtship drenched in cruelty. But the worst part, it was all normalized. In an era when torture was state-sanctioned and the church itself approved public executions, the line between discipline and sadism didn't exist. And for a woman like Elizabeth, that moral vacuum became fertile ground. The castle wasn't just a home, it was a laboratory for power, a place where she could experiment with dominance unchecked by law, religion, or conscience. Her victims were always beneath her servants, peasant girls, orphans, people society already deemed expendable. And as her power grew, so did her methods. She learned how long the human body could scream before the voice broke, how the skin reacts to freezing water, how eyes look when someone realizes they won't make it out alive. This wasn't sudden madness. It was a slow education, one sanctioned by silence. And as her body matured into a noblewoman's form, her heart calcified into something else entirely, a creature who equated pain with power and compassion with weakness. Because if there's one thing her childhood taught her, it was this: to survive in a world ruled by fear, you must learn to become the thing that others fear most. And she did. Behind closed doors and beneath silken gowns, Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just a countess. She was a student of suffering, and soon she would graduate into something far more terrifying. Not a woman of her time, but a warning to all time. It wasn't a wedding. It was an unholy alliance signed not with vows, but with screams. At just 15 years old, Elizabeth Bathory was married off to Count Ferenc Nádasdy, one of Hungary's wealthiest, most ruthless noblemen. The union was less about love and more about land bloodlines and power consolidation. She brought a name of ancient prestige. He brought brutal military clout. Together they would form a dynasty that would bathe Central Europe in both wealth and whispers of horror. The wedding itself was extravagant: 2,000 guests, endless banquets, priceless gifts. But beneath the gold-threaded ceremony lurked a different kind of transaction. Elizabeth wasn't just gaining a husband, she was inheriting a legacy of blood. Ferenc, known on the battlefield as the Black Knight of Hungary, had earned his reputation through savage efficiency. He didn't just defeat enemies, he humiliated and tortured them. And he would pass that knowledge on to his young bride, not through lessons, but through life. Their new home was Castle Choctich, nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains, isolated, gloomy, and soon to become infamous. While other noblewomen adjusted to their roles as hostesses and mothers, Elizabeth and Ferenc bonded over pain. Servants who disobeyed weren't reprimanded, they were maimed. Maids who dropped dishes weren't scolded, they were whipped, burned, or worse. Some historians believe Ferenc encouraged Elizabeth's cruelty, others believe she surpassed him. But one thing is certain, he opened the door and she walked through it willingly. One legend says Ferenc taught Elizabeth how to stuff oiled paper between a servant girl's toes and light it on fire to punish her for being slow. Another story describes the tickling method, sharp needles jabbed beneath fingernails while victims were forced to smile. This wasn't folklore. This was a household routine. Pain became the love language of their marriage, refined, calculated, artistic. Ferenc, often away at war, left Elizabeth in full control of the estate. And when he returned, he brought new tactics, fresh horrors to add to her growing repertoire. They weren't just nobles. They were architects of agony. But what made it truly terrifying was the social status that cloaked it all. In public, Elizabeth hosted grand feasts, smiled for portraits donated to churches. In private, she was growing into something else, a predator in a silk dress, honing her skills with every passing month, protected by a husband who shared her hunger. And yet, for all his cruelty, Ferenc was still the more conventional monster. He directed violence outward toward enemies, rebels, outsiders. Elizabeth, however, turned inward. She used her power on the powerless. Her prey weren't soldiers, they were girls. Young, poor, forgotten. When Ferenc died in 1604 from a mysterious illness, possibly a battle wound or internal infection, Elizabeth didn't mourn. She evolved. With her violent tutor gone, she was no longer just a wife with dark hobbies. She was now a widow with no restraints. No one left to share the blame. No one left to hide behind. Only her. And what followed would stain her name into history. Because without Ferenc, the whispers grew louder. The disappearances more frequent, the punishments more grotesque. He may have lit the first match, but she was the fire. It started with a slap. It ended with hundreds of corpses. They say the moment came suddenly. A young servant girl, trembling, tugged too hard while brushing Elizabeth Bathory's hair. The Countess, already irritable from grief, aging, and rage, struck her. Blood splattered across her hand. And then, something twisted in her expression. Not revulsion, not regret, but fascination. That drop of blood was the spark that ignited a frenzy. Something snapped, and once it did, there was no return. The grief of losing her husband, Ferenc, the boredom of aristocratic isolation, the unchecked power coursing through her veins, it all coalesced into something monstrous. Elizabeth Bathory wasn't just cruel anymore. She was hungry. She began experimenting quietly, methodically. Servants would disappear, dismissed in the night with whispered excuses. But inside Castle Choctich, horrific rituals were unfolding. Girls were stripped, bound, and tortured. Elizabeth tested how far a body could bend before bones shattered, how much blood could be drained before death, how long screams could echo in the stone corridors. This wasn't punishment, it was performance, and she didn't work alone. A small circle of loyal accomplices, maids, castle guards, even a local witch helped procure victims and hide evidence. They lured peasant girls with promises of employment or education. Most were never seen again. The methods grew more sadistic. Needles under fingernails were replaced with molten wax, red-hot irons, ice baths in the dead of winter. She bathed in blood, rubbed it into her skin. Some accounts claimed she believed it would preserve her youth. Others suggest she simply reveled in control, the godlike thrill of creating and destroying at will. Each act became a rehearsal for the next. And with every new scream, Elizabeth grew colder, more detached. She no longer needed reasons. A dirty apron, a crooked glance, a stutter, any excuse would do. Her chambers became laboratories of pain, each victim a nameless specimen in her descent into madness. But what's most terrifying is how long she got away with it. No one dared challenge her. She was nobility. Her victims were commoners. Even local priests hesitated. The law turned a blind eye. And as long as she confined her horrors to peasants, society looked the other way. Until she got greedy. Elizabeth began targeting daughters of minor nobility. Young girls sent to her castle for education and refinement. These girls too disappeared. But they had names, families, influence. The rumors grew impossible to ignore. Blood leaked from beneath locked doors. The smell of decay clung to her castle walls. Villagers whispered about carts full of bodies buried in the forest. Something was wrong at Chakticha, and everyone knew it. She wasn't a grieving widow anymore. She was the hunter in her own fairy tale. And the woods were full of bones. Her transformation into one of history's most prolific female serial killers wasn't sudden, it was gradual, like rot beneath a beautiful painting. A woman born into privilege, hardened by power, freed by loss, consumed by sadism. And unlike most killers, she didn't lurk in shadows. She wore silk, she drank wine, she smiled. Until one day the world stopped smiling back. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. The most chilling part of Elizabeth Bathory's crimes wasn't just the blood or the body count, it was the order behind the horror. What happened within the walls of Castle Chaktich wasn't a spontaneous explosion of madness. It was a system built and perfected over years. Elizabeth didn't kill alone. She had helpers. Loyal, silent, brutal. There was Dorothea Sentes, the sadistic former wet nurse known for her violent streak. Ilona Jo, the servant-turned-enabler who cleaned up the blood. Janos Uvari, nicknamed Fichko, a castle manservant who tied the ropes and delivered blows. And Katarina Benica, a mysterious figure rumored to be a local healer or a witch, who may have whispered the rituals of pain in Elizabeth's ear. Together, they formed a closed circle, a court of cruelty. Each had a role. Dorothea administered torture with pleasure, reportedly slapping, cutting, and branding girls under Elizabeth's instruction. Fichko dragged the victims in and disposed of the remains, often burying them hastily or burning them in secret. Ilona provided false stories to family members and villagers when daughters vanished without a trace. They didn't question, they obeyed, because to defy Elizabeth Bathory was to join the dead. Witness accounts later revealed how efficient the process became. New girls would be brought in, sometimes 4 or 5 at once. They were examined, stripped, inspected like livestock. Some were saved for later, others were used immediately. The chamber was cold, dark, echoing with screams. It was industrial-scale murder dressed in aristocratic silk. Over time, even the most horrific acts became routine. Biting, starving, freezing, beating, burning. Girls were forced to eat their own flesh. One was sewn into the carcass of a dead horse. It wasn't just punishment, it was psychological destruction. And yet, outside those walls, the castle still hosted parties. Guests dined on silver plates while the smell of rot seeped through floorboards. Elizabeth smiled, composed, polite. She played the noblewoman by day and the executioner by night. The dichotomy was terrifying. The question often asked is, why didn't anyone stop her sooner? But the answer is more disturbing than silence. It was permission. Society had trained itself to ignore the suffering of peasants. Girls without titles were invisible. They didn't matter, and Elizabeth knew it. She weaponized that indifference. For years, whispers drifted from the castle. Stories told by escaping maids, confessions from tear-streaked survivors who fled barefoot into the woods. But no one in power listened, until she went too far. When she began targeting young, noble girls, her web began to unravel. A failed escape, a missing heiress, and finally, an accusation that couldn't be ignored. But even then, it wasn't the violence that shocked the courts. It was how organized it had become. Dozens of testimonies would describe logbooks of victims, patterns of disposal, rituals repeated like clockwork, hundreds of bodies. This wasn't madness. It was method. And what of her accomplices? When the truth finally surfaced, they were arrested. Some begged for mercy. Some stood by their actions. One claimed Elizabeth drank the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Another said she kept a list of every girl she killed, a ledger of death. Their fates would be gruesome: torture, execution, dissection. But Elizabeth She would be spared the axe because of her name. It wasn't just the cruelty, it was the calm. That's what makes her story unforgettable. It started with a rumor, but ended with a locked door and the silence of the dead. For years, whispers had coiled like smoke through the Hungarian countryside. Girls disappearing, families mourning without answers, locals speaking of screams echoing from Castle Choctich on moonless nights. But the elite, they looked the other way. After all, who would dare accuse a countess? That all changed in 1610. A powerful man named György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and a distant relative of Elizabeth Bathory, was finally ordered to act, not by a desperate villager or grieving mother, but by the King of Hungary himself, Matthias II. You see, Elizabeth had crossed a line. She began killing noble-born girls, daughters of minor aristocrats sent to her for etiquette training, and the whispers could no longer be ignored. But this was no ordinary investigation. It was a chess game of blood and politics. Thurzo knew the Bathory name was sacred. She was connected to royal blood, to military commanders, bishops, and war heroes. Arresting her could trigger scandal or even rebellion, so he had to proceed with care, quietly, strategically. And so began the most infamous manhunt in Eastern European history. Thurzo compiled testimonies from over 300 witnesses. Former servants, neighbors, even priests all spoke of mutilated corpses, of torture devices, of walls stained dark red. One castle worker described a secret torture chamber hidden behind a false wall. Another claimed they saw Elizabeth bathe in blood. One girl, barely alive, was found hiding in a pile of rags, her body broken, her spirit shattered. The evidence was overwhelming. But there was no trial, no public accusation. Instead, Thurzo rode to Castle Choctich on December 29, 1610, under cover of night, accompanied by soldiers and clergy. What they found inside would sear itself into history. A girl dead and frozen laid near the gates. Another dying, barely breathing, covered in wounds. A third, naked, bleeding, chained to the wall. It wasn't a rumor anymore. Elizabeth Bathory was caught in the act. And yet, no scream, no fight, just icy composure. She was arrested and taken into custody, though not in chains. Unlike her victims, Elizabeth was not thrown into a dungeon. She was not paraded through the streets. No. She was nobility. And that meant appearances had to be preserved. But what truly shocked the kingdom was this: she was never put on trial. Thurzo convened a secret tribunal. Elizabeth's accomplices, Dorothea, Ilona Fichko, were tortured and interrogated. They confessed everything: the murders, the methods, the countess's commands. Some claimed over 600 girls had died. Others swore they saw her write down every name as if keeping score. Her accomplices were sentenced to death, publicly executed in horrific fashion. Their bodies served as warnings, but Elizabeth She was walled inside her own castle, alive, alone, forgotten. One window, no visitors, just her and her past. For 4 years she lived in that bricked-up tomb, writing feverishly in the dark, praying, whispering to ghosts that never answered. No one knows what she thought, if she ever felt remorse, or if she simply waited for history to forget. But history never did. Because that night, the raid, the evidence, the silence proved what no one wanted to believe: monsters don't always live in the forest. Sometimes they wear crowns, and sometimes the blood they spill is legal, noble, and centuries in the making. It was called a trial, but it wasn't justice. It was damage control. After Elizabeth Bathory's arrest in December 1610, the world expected a reckoning. Hundreds of testimonies, dozens of bodies, mountains of evidence. The scale of horror demanded a courtroom, demanded a sentence, demanded answers. But there was one problem: she was a Bathory. Noble blood in 17th century Hungary was a shield stronger than steel. Elizabeth wasn't just a countess, she was a cousin to the king, a symbol of national pride, and one of the wealthiest landowners in the region. Putting her on trial meant putting the entire aristocracy under a microscope. So instead of a public trial, they created a performance, a carefully controlled inquest hidden from public eyes. The court convened in January 1611, led by Palatine Gheorghe Thurzo, the man who had arrested her. But Elizabeth herself was not allowed to attend. She was never given a chance to speak, to confess, to deny. Her voice was erased. Instead, the stage was given to her four closest servants, the ones who had helped lure, restrain, and dispose of the victims. Dorothea Sentes, Ilona Jo, Janos Uivari, nicknamed Fichko, and Katarina Benica. Their testimonies were the stuff of nightmares. Dorothea admitted to burning girls with hot irons and cutting off fingers with shears. Ilona described burying the dead under the castle floors. Fichko confessed to carrying bodies, some still breathing, into the woods to die in the snow. Katarina said she tried to help the girls but was too afraid to resist the countess's commands. Some claimed Elizabeth had killed over 600 girls. Others said the number was closer to 80. Either way, the details were unthinkable beatings with clubs, starving, freezing, burning, biting, mutilation, with needles, and the infamous rumor that she bathed in virgin blood to preserve her youth. But here's the catch. None of it came from Elizabeth's mouth. Every confession came secondhand, extracted through torture, shaped by fear, manipulated by politics. The verdict swift and symbolic. The accomplices were sentenced to death. Dorothea and Ilona had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive. Fichko was beheaded. Katarina, who claimed to have resisted, was spared execution but sentenced to life in prison. And Elizabeth She was never convicted, never formally charged, never allowed to face her accusers. Instead, the court declared her mentally unfit to stand trial and ordered her to be confined in her own castle, bricked into a single room with no windows. A symbolic punishment dressed in aristocratic dignity. It was a sentence of silence. 4 years passed, no contact with the outside world, no word from the crown, no visitors, only a narrow slot to receive food, no trial, no justice, only darkness. She became a ghost in her own fortress, a breathing legend trapped in stone. In August 1614, a guard peeked through the slot. Her food had gone untouched. She was slumped in the corner, cold, still gone. Elizabeth Bathory died without a final word, but her story didn't. Because the trial wasn't just about punishing crimes, it was about protecting power, preserving names, hiding the sins of the elite behind closed doors and bricked walls. And in doing so, they created something even more terrifying than a killer. They created a myth, one that would echo for centuries, one that blurred fact and fear, one that still dares to ask, was she a monster or a mirror held up to a monstrous world? No trial, no verdict, no public execution, just 4 walls, a single slit in stone, and time crawling like rot. Elizabeth Bathory, once the most feared woman in Eastern Europe, now lived as a phantom in her own castle. After the secretive inquest in 1611, she was entombed inside Čachtich Castle, not as punishment, but as a political solution. She was too powerful to be executed, too dangerous to be freed. So, they buried her alive, brick by brick. Her prison cell was not metaphorical. It was literal. 1 window bricked over, 1 door sealed with stone. 1 narrow opening remained to pass food and remove waste. The Countess of Blood, once robed in silks and shadow, now lived in filth, silence, and forgotten luxury. Outside, her legend festered. Locals whispered that her screams echoed through the hills. Some claimed her spirit wandered the castle halls at night searching for young blood. Others believed she was still killing from behind the walls. Truth and myth intertwined like veins in a corpse. But inside, the monster was fading. Stripped of her power, her servants, her wealth, Elizabeth Bathory began to decay, not just physically but spiritually. The woman who once orchestrated torture chambers and banquets of pain was now just a shadow crawling between memory and madness. There were no mirrors in her prison, but she didn't need them. She had become her own ghost. Her body withered from neglect. Her skin, once rumored to be bathed in blood, grew pale and sickly. The aristocrat who once demanded obedience with a whisper now could barely speak. She scribbled on the walls, perhaps prayers, perhaps names, perhaps nothing at all. Time eroded her vanity. Her mind crumbled under the weight of silence. She did not rage. She diminished. Every day was a silent performance of regret or denial. No priest came to absolve her. No one asked for her final words. The guards outside rarely spoke. Her name was scrubbed from royal favor. Her legacy was already being edited, erased, then resurrected as folklore. And then on August 21st, 1614, it ended without ceremony. The guard brought her food as he had every day for nearly 4 years. But that morning there was no response. He looked through the slit. Her body was slumped in the corner, face down, cold still. She had died alone, without confession, without forgiveness, without the judgment she was never officially given. Some said it was a stroke. Others said she starved herself. But the truth? She was already dead long before she stopped breathing. Her burial was quiet. No procession, no monument. They interred her body in the village cemetery, but when locals found out, they demanded it be removed. Even in death, she wasn't welcome. Her final resting place remains unknown. And maybe that's fitting, because Elizabeth Bathory didn't just die. She dissolved into nightmare rumor and historical debate. The noblewoman became a symbol. The human became a legend. The legend became a warning, not just about one woman's cruelty, but about what happens when power is unchecked and evil is allowed to fester behind silk curtains. Her end wasn't bloody. It was silent, slow, rotting from the inside. The world had created a monster and then buried it alive. What do you call a woman who drinks blood, tortures virgins, and vanishes into the stone walls of her own castle? A murderer, a myth, or something darker? Centuries after her death, Elizabeth Bathory is no longer just a historical figure. She's a specter, a symbol, a cultural obsession. Her name has become synonymous with female monstrosity, and the line between fact and fiction has blurred into shadow. Today she's remembered not for her title Countess of Hungary or her royal blood, but as the Blood Countess, a name soaked in horror, whispered in haunted tours, splashed across horror novels, video games, and even metal albums. She's been portrayed as a vampire, a witch, a satanic priestess, and always as the woman who bathed in blood to stay young. But here's the chilling truth. There's no solid evidence she ever did. The infamous bloodbath story only appeared a century after her death, crafted by writers hungry for shock, not accuracy. Yet it stuck, because the image was too powerful, too cinematic. A beautiful, pale noblewoman reclining in crimson eternal youth dripping from her sins. It's grotesque. It's irresistible. And that's where the obsession lies. Bathory's story taps into a primal fear, the fear of the beautiful predator, a woman who defies gender roles not with virtue, but with violence. She flips the script. In a world where women were expected to be submissive, nurturing, delicate Elizabeth is dominant, cruel, and insatiably powerful. And for that, she becomes more terrifying than any man. In modern pop culture, she's joined the ranks of Dracula, Medusa, and Lady Macbeth icons who blur the boundary between human and monster. And like them, Bathory reflects something about us. Our fascination with power, our horror at female rage, our need to turn complex humans into one-dimensional legends. But there's another layer. Her legend reveals how history is written not just with ink, but with agenda. The men who accused her were powerful. She was wealthy, widowed, and owned vast land. Silencing her wasn't just punishment, it was politics. Her estate was seized, her story was spun, and centuries later we're still devouring it without always questioning who wrote it. Maybe that's the real horror, that we love our monsters more than we love our truth. Yet even knowing the distortions, we can't look away. Bathory is a cultural mirror reflecting our darkest fascinations. We dress her up for Halloween. We sell her image on t-shirts. We retell her crimes as bedtime horror. And in doing so, we keep her alive not in history books, but in whispers, clicks, and screenplays. She's the villain we can't stop watching. Because deep down, we're not just afraid of her. We're fascinated by how much of her lives in us, in our lust for control, in our hunger for youth, in our blind belief in stories that entertain more than they inform. Elizabeth Bathory may have died behind stone walls, but in the theater of the modern mind, she's immortal. Not because she bathed in blood, but because we did. What turns a noblewoman into a butcher of girls? Was Elizabeth Bathory born a monster, or was she created by a world that taught her cruelty was power? To understand the woman behind the myth, we have to step past the blood-stained legends and walk into her psyche, not to excuse, but to expose. Elizabeth was born into a violent world. The 16th century kingdom of Hungary was a place where nobles ruled like gods and peasants were treated as disposable. From childhood, she witnessed torture as discipline executions, as entertainment, and dominance as divine right. Her own family practiced brutality. Her uncle was rumored to summon demons. Her aunt taught her dark rituals. In that twisted environment, violence wasn't horrifying, it was normalized. Now, add to that immense privilege. Elizabeth was not just rich, she was untouchable. From a young age, she owned land, commanded servants, and was expected to uphold a dynasty. Her husband, Ferenc Nádasdy, a brutal warrior nicknamed the Black Knight of Hungary, reinforced these lessons. When he wasn't waging war, he taught Elizabeth how to punish disobedient maids, leaving her with tools of power and perhaps trauma masked as tradition. But trauma doesn't disappear. It metastasizes. Beneath the surface, Elizabeth was reportedly plagued by migraines, fits of rage, paranoia. In modern terms, she may have suffered from a combination of PTSD, narcissistic traits, and possibly even psychopathy, all exacerbated by unchecked privilege and zero consequences. In an age without mental health care, her descent into sadism could flourish behind castle walls, ignored by those who benefited from her wealth. Yet the psychological analysis is only half the picture. There's a social sickness here too, a society that valued women only for their fertility, obedience, and appearance. Elizabeth, brilliant and ambitious, lived in a cage of velvet. Her mind, sharper than many men around her, had no place in court politics. Her body, aging in a world obsessed with youth, became a battlefield. And as she lost control of her image, she tried to reclaim power in the most grotesque way imaginable, by controlling the lives and deaths of young girls. It's a perverse irony she was both a victim of patriarchy and a terrifying enforcer of it. She turned the tools used against women, vanity, cruelty, competition, into weapons. In trying to preserve youth and status, she destroyed the very thing society demanded from her femininity. And we, centuries later, still tell her story not just as history but as a warning, because Elizabeth Bathory reveals a truth we don't like to face. Power without limits corrupts absolutely, especially when it masks itself in silk and lace. She wasn't just a serial killer. She was the product of a violent world, a broken hierarchy, and a toxic standard of beauty that devoured her soul from the inside out. Her cruelty was not born, it was cultured. And as we peel back the layers, the legend becomes more terrifying, not less. Not because it was supernatural, but because it was all too human. She died sealed behind walls, but her shadow still walks among us. Centuries after her final breath, the name Elizabeth Bathory still sends a chill down the spine. Not just because of what she did, but because of what she represents. She wasn't just a woman who bathed in blood. She became something more enduring, more disturbing, a mirror held up to society's darkest obsessions. And that mirror has never stopped reflecting. In her time, Elizabeth's crimes were monstrous, but the fascination that followed was even more telling. As word of her torture chambers spread through Europe, so did the morbid curiosity. Pamphlets were printed, songs were sung. She was turned into a legend, not just out of horror but out of hunger. A hunger to believe in monsters. Because it's easier than admitting that society breeds them. Even today, her name echoes in pop culture. She appears in horror films, vampire stories, even fashion campaigns, her pale skin, dripping rubies, velvet gowns. She has become an icon, aestheticized and distorted. But why? Why do we, centuries later, still romanticize someone who likely slaughtered hundreds of young girls? The answer is uncomfortable because her story touches every era's pressure points: beauty, power, youth, femininity, and the price paid to preserve them. In a world still obsessed with anti-aging creams, status, and perfection, Elizabeth's legend feels eerily modern. She feared growing old, losing control, becoming invisible in a patriarchal world. She reacted with horror. Today that fear isn't gone, it's just marketed differently. It's on our screens, in our filters, our feeds, our surgeries. Youth at any cost is no longer whispered in castle corridors. It's shouted through algorithms. Her legacy also haunts justice. Elizabeth was not tried in a public court. Her status protected her until the crimes were impossible to bury. Even then, she was never truly held accountable, locked away quietly while her accomplices died for her sins. Sound familiar? We still live in a world where the powerful evade consequences, while the less privileged take the fall. Whether it's celebrities, CEOs, or politicians, our modern world still plays by the same brutal script. But perhaps the most haunting parallel is the silence that surrounded her. For years, no one stopped her. Servants disappeared. Families mourned in whispers. The local peasants knew but feared, because to accuse a countess was to risk everything. That silence is a legacy we still fight. The fear of speaking truth to power. The cost of holding monsters accountable, especially when they wear crowns or walk red carpets. And so, Elizabeth Bathory remains with us not as a myth, but as a warning of what happens when beauty becomes currency, when status replaces morality, when pain becomes private, and silence becomes survival. She is a grotesque echo of the same forces still at play in our boardrooms, on our timelines, in our mirrors. We no longer build castles, but we still build images. We still worship youth, and we still look the other way until the blood starts to show. In the end, Elizabeth's true horror may not be what she did. It's what we still do. They were not just names lost to time. They were daughters, sisters, friends. We speak of Elizabeth Bathory's victims in numbers 650, some say. But history has a cruel way of dehumanizing the fallen, reducing them to shadows, erasing their faces, forgetting their voices. And in doing so, we let the monster steal even more than their lives. We let her steal their dignity. But those girls lived, they dreamed, they laughed, they bled, aft. Most were peasants born into poverty, voiceless in a feudal world where nobility could murder with impunity. Their families were promised opportunity. Their mothers hoped they'd serve in a noble household and earn enough to help feed their siblings. They never expected their daughters would be tortured for pleasure. But the walls of Chaktichi Castle swallowed them. Their cries were muffled by stone. Their names never made it to the record books. What if we paused to imagine one, a 14-year-old named Anna? Perhaps she loved to braid her hair with wildflowers. Maybe she once kissed a boy by the river. Maybe she believed the Countess would be kind. Instead, she met cruelty too profound for words. Her final moments weren't cinematic. They were slow, terrifying, alone. And now multiply that by hundreds. This isn't just a story about a killer. It's a story about those who were forgotten because they were poor, because they were girls, because their pain wasn't worth documenting. And that is the wound that still bleeds. Today we still struggle to give voice to the voiceless. We still allow systems to silence the vulnerable. Victims of abuse, poverty, and systemic violence are often dismissed until the crime becomes too grotesque to ignore. But by then, it's too late. That's why this story still matters. Because behind every sensational headline, every monster myth, every viral video, there are real people. And if we're not careful, we risk turning horror into entertainment. We risk watching suffering without compassion. We risk forgetting that justice is not just about punishing the villain, it's about remembering the victims. So what can we learn? We learn that silence is complicity, that the pedestal of power must always be questioned, that the cost of ignoring suffering is far greater than the price of speaking up. We learn that dignity is not reserved for the privileged, that every life, rich or poor, noble or common, has value. We learn that the world doesn't just need more justice, It needs more humanity. And most of all, we learn that history isn't just about what happened, it's about how we remember it. So let us remember differently. Let us tell the stories not just of tyrants, but of the innocents they destroyed. Let us see faces where history left blanks. Let us speak the names no one bothered to record. Because the moment we remember them, we reclaim something sacred. We reclaim our empathy. We reclaim our responsibility. And we make sure that no monster, no matter how powerful, can erase a soul again. Not without the world watching. Not without us speaking. Not without a fight. If this story moved, you don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Every voice matters. Save this video to revisit the truth they tried to erase. And if you believe more people should remember the forgotten, hit that subscribe button. This channel brings light to the darkest corners of history, and your support helps keep these stories alive. Let's make sure the victims aren't just names in the past. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be heard. Like, comment, save, and subscribe, because history only lives on if we choose to carry it forward.